Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Round 8 of the candidates were over the halfway stage, and there was lots of fighting chess in round 8, apart from one game actually where Jan Nepomniachtchi actually played a very solid line against Ding, and well, he was obviously content to make a draw, and that drifted towards a draw fairly quickly. Let me just show you very quickly what happened in Richard Rapport against Jan Krzysztof Duda. Now remember, Rapport lost yesterday in round 7 against Nepo in a theoretical variation of the Petrov. And today against Duda, Rapport faced the Petrov again. But here in round 8, he decided, okay, forget your theory. He just played knight c3 and protected the pawn. So they had a 4 knights and then g3. Again, this is just kind of anti-theory. You know, it's just a very solid line. I mean, you can't really prepare against this. And it worked. So basically, the players just played chess. Not a lot of preparation involved here. And it worked well for Richard Rapport. Here's the position after 28 moves, and after knight e4, a very elegant move. Duda resigned. If the knight flies in, then that'll be decisive. And if it's taken, then queen h5. So the queen hits the h file, and the point is that once black takes this knight, the f file is open, so the king cannot escape. For example, rook g7. Now check. Check on the f file. That's the decisive check, and then checkmate on f7. There we go. I mean, there are other lines, but you get the idea. So I'm really pleased for Richard Rapport that he's managed to bounce back, and he's back on 50%. But let's move on to the main game I want to talk about, which was Hikaru Nakamura with white against Fabiano Caruana. Now, if you remember, in the first half of the tournament, Caruana won a very nice, quite strategic game against Nakamura. Just outclassed him, actually. So could Nakamura bounce back? It's a Spanish, and Caruana selects an open Spanish. Well, that will guarantee a very double-edged position. So this is the starting position of the open Spanish. So the bishop needs to protect that pawn. You can see that, you know, white has this pawn majority on the king side. If you can get that rolling, that's great. But to balance that, black has a pawn majority in the centre. There's also this knight on e4 to deal with. But anyway, let's take a look at what happened. What's interesting is that Caruana selects a variation, knight takes f2. This was analysed by an English amateur, Vernon Dilworth, who played correspondence chess, and he analysed this and played it, and this was published, some of his analysis was published in Chess Magazine. This was in the early 1940s, and it was picked up and spotted by Mikhail Botvinnik, who used it in one of his games, and that's how this variation became famous, and the name has stuck, the Dilworth variation. There we go, named after an English amateur. And this is the main line. So the idea is that the king is just a little bit displaced and black opens the position. Now the old main line was to exchange on f6, and then white plays knight f1. You need to develop, you need to bring these pieces over very quickly. But it was found that black had, well, enough counterplay here. There's a kind of dynamic balance. Artur Yusupov used to play like this as black quite a lot. But the modern way of playing this position is to decline the pawn on f6 and play knight f1. This obviously gives black another pawn, so it's now rook and 2 pawns against bishop and knight. But it can often be the case that these pawns are a little bit vulnerable, because remember, whenever they advance, it creates weaknesses. Or here, that will create weaknesses on d4, for example. And this has been quite a popular line over the last couple of years. Frankly, I look at this and I think white has a great position. I just love these bishops, and it feels as though black has taken on an enormous responsibility with this centre. And it's, a centre is fine when you can advance it and power through, but it is very hard to get those pawns going because, as I explained, whenever they advance, they create weaknesses. And white's minor pieces will just slot into those weaknesses. So Caruana himself had this position as white, and he had to face rook d8, but, well, today he went for bishop f5. Certainly, black would like to exchange off a pair of bishops, because 2 bishops work very well together. But Nakamura declines an exchange and attacks this one. And queen e1. Knight a5 and queen f2. So this looks very nice. The bishop prepares to come into c5. So this knight, well, it doesn't have time really to take that bishop. Once the bishop slots in here, that's really nice. That bishop is anchored there, and it will be very difficult to advance these pawns. That's why Caruana played the knight back to b7. Now rook e1 and c5. Well, that is an impressive centre. I still feel that white should be better here, just because the minor pieces look, well, the minor pieces have great potential, but it's obviously very tricky. And here Hikaru said that he actually had prepared this line. He sort of guessed right the night before, spent a couple of hours preparing. And the main computer move here is bishop g5 to open up the e file, attacking the rook as well. And if rook here, then this wins that pawn, basically. So black would play c4, and now there's a forcing sequence. So now white is a whole piece up. However, that rook is entombed on a1. The computer says white is better. However, in practice, I think that might be very, very difficult. And no doubt Caruana had prepared that. However, Nakamura had sort of forgot that, or maybe he wasn't sure about it, and he played knight g3. And then queen d2. And I think this is also a very reasonable way for white to play, actually. This bishop, well, it's got a slight problem, basically. On the surface of it, it looks quite nice to have it anchored in the middle of the board. But actually, however that's protected, creates problems. So, for example, if e4, knight h4, that knight would like to come in here. Queen e5. Bishop f2, so be careful, there's a pin here. And it's just a very unclear position, but I repeat, I feel that this centre is a bit static, actually. It's hard for black to get that going. But it is, the computer just sort of says unclear. Anyway, Caruana obviously wasn't completely convinced by that and played c4, attacking the bishop, which came back. But now there is a problem, because it is very hard to advance these pawns. Yes, the bishop looks wonderful on d3, but white is going to play around that. And how do you advance through d4 when white has all these pieces directed on d4? but also if black plays e4, then the knight or bishop potentially will sit on that beautiful d4 square. So I think from this moment the position is starting to clarify and it really looks very nice for white. So pressure here, and e4 is the move that white is trying to induce. And this is very nice. Caruana doesn't bother defending that, but plays rook f7. So there's a pin here. However, now Nakamura's next move I think is a bit of a start move. Knight h1, great move. Defending the bishop. And that reinstates the threat of knight takes e5. So Caruana decided, okay, now is the time to push. I mean, if black decides to simply defend like this, then bishop g3, you can see the pressure mounting. I mean, this is absolutely horrible now. So that's why he decided to push. But this just looks fantastic for white now. Still a bit unclear, you know, black's pieces are active, but this is another very nice move from Nakamura, h4. He wants to be able to push the queen out of the way and then bring the bishop into play. And if h5, then the queen will come to g5. And queen exchange looks nice. Again, you know, white will slowly emerge from the first two ranks, and then white will just be better. It's very hard for black to actually do anything here. So h4 played, knight c5, h5, bishop g4, there we go, the bishop emerging into the game. You can see how this knight also isn't a wonderful piece because it's just hitting its own pieces. h6, queen e3, little by little white is emerging and these pieces need to come into play now. Queen f4, Caruana could see nothing better, exchanges queens, and here white has more than one good continuation. Bishop e6 is also a good move, but knight e6 was played, forcing exchange, and that meant that Nakamura could take back one of those pawns in the middle. But rook f5, and this h-pawn disappears, which is a pity. Nevertheless, that bishop emerges now on that rock-solid square d4. And it still looks wonderful for white. This e-pawn is potentially weak. This knight is hopping out to one of these squares. Still just looks winning for white to me. Eventually, you know, it takes time to regroup, but still, it doesn't look that difficult a task. Not when you've got that bishop anchored to d4. Now, let me see. Knight f2. So a bit of pressure here. Rook f7. b4. Nice move. Preparing a4. h5. a4. I mean, there are other ways to play, but I think this looks very nice indeed to break up these pawns so that a6 is potentially a target now. h4. Bishop e3 knocks the rook back. And here, perhaps the best way to play is bishop e8 with this idea. Bishop d7, just to displace those rooks. And, well, as we'll see in the game, h3 was a bit disruptive, but this stops h3. And then white can turn to rook a1. Okay, here's the problem. Rook a1, which looks absolutely fine. And basically, given another move, let's say bishop d1 and bishop g4, the bishops are wonderful. This rook is playing on the a file. I think black is utterly lost. h3 is quite disruptive. Good counterattack from Caruana. If that's taken, check. And rook e1. Watch out for that e-pawn. If it's taken with the pawn, then rook f3 hits the bishop, and then there could be a check here. Or, you know, advancing with e3. Not so clear, basically. So Nakamura had to play rook a2, a little bit of defense. And then bishop back to cover on the king side, which is still good for white. I still love white's position. You know, Nakamura is still in control here. We just got to be very careful. Bishop d4. Yeah, bishop comes back to this wonderful square. And now the king comes in. So, yeah, I mean, you can quibble with some of Nakamura's moves, but basically he hasn't lost control here. He's played extremely well. And now the king comes in. I mean, this is obviously progress. Black's rooks have now been split. You know that's a cardinal sin in my book. They're not working well together, and white has beautiful coordination here. And here, just at the moment when I think, you know, we can all see that Nakamura has advanced and his position has reached its zenith here, and it feels like black is going to be just pushed off the board any moment. Here is where Nakamura makes a mistake. Everything would run smoothly if he just played rook f2, protecting the bishop, and then on the next turn it's possible to play knight d5, attacking the rook, and then, well, the rook will have to move. There'll be an attack against the king. Basically, I don't think black's king is going to survive there at all. Rook f2, I think, is a pretty simple move. But this is move 54. They'd already been playing a very long time. They were, I think, into the 5th or 6th hour of play. And Nakamura rushed it with knight d5, which looks just like a winning move, but Caruana sacked an exchange, which means Nakamura is now a whole piece up. There's an extra knight, but the e-pawn is running. Check. And, you know, when you've worked so hard to achieve a winning position, you know, you've seen all the tricks, and suddenly you've got to fight again. Yes, white must be winning because this pawn isn't going through. Nevertheless, everything is protected. Once the rook gets into the game, it's going to be a bit tricky. So this is really tough for white now. But Nakamura held his nerve. Now, there are lots of subtleties to this position. And yeah, maybe Nakamura could have done it a little bit better, but basically he didn't lose control. He had to fall back. But he did fine. Probably a bit more tenacious to play rook h1 here, but here's the winning idea. Basically, white, if black does nothing, let's say, I don't know, let's make a passing move, I don't know, random move, king here. So white wants to play bishop f2 and then knight e1 with a secure blockade and take it from there, basically. But if bishop e4, so you've got to be careful, but this can be taken, and you know, this endgame, that's a plausible endgame that could arise, but white should be winning there. You know, once the king comes over and the bishop and knight are anchored on these good squares, that pawn is going to drop eventually. Okay, back we come. So rook f6 check, knight g2. So white has achieved that position I mentioned with a nice blockade, and this is rock solid. And the rook comes, there you go, that's even better. The rook goes behind the pawn, makes it very secure, and the rook is active as well. And here Caruana resigned. Basically this pawn is going to drop. And then, you can slowly surround this pawn. Eventually knight here and taking it will win. But first of all, remove that one. So basically Nakamura is still in control. And, well, let's say this. Here. The king will have to go back. The king comes over and, yeah. Eventually, we're going to be able to shuffle that knight round. Let's take on e2 with a winning position. And that's just one way of winning. You could also bring the king round here and take here. Well, I think, a really interesting game. Nakamura, I think, did extremely well to keep control. Fabiano Caruana, big disappointment for him. He fought so hard, but I just don't like that opening system. Computers will tell you otherwise, but I just feel that this position is easier for white to play than black, because black has to try to hold this centre, but white's minor pieces have so much potential. Anyway, it's all a question of taste. Now, scores. So Nepo drew, took it very easily. Yeah, he now has 6 out of 8. Caruana, after that loss, has 5. Nakamura has 4.5. Rapport has 4. So those are the top places. There are 6 rounds to go, but Nepo a point clear, looking very good at the moment, but everything can happen in 6 rounds. Round 9 pairings, fascinating. We have Caruana against Nepomniachtchi. That's the top 2 players facing each other, with Caruana having white. Could be very significant. Can he pick himself up and have a go at Nepo in the next round? Let's see. Thanks very much for watching.